So one way to understand the thread that runs through all three plays, it's somehow, the issue is judging. And therefore, it's somehow appropriate that the plays move toward the founding of an institution that's designed to make judging possible. So the jury. Now, in the Agamemnon, the chorus seem at first to be presented as though they're in a way perfect judges. They try to give themselves, that they present themselves as being in a way utterly objective. They're totally skeptical. For them, they announce seeing is believing. Of course, we have some reason to doubt all this. We have reasons, multiple reasons to doubt all this. We notice, if we look a little carefully, their complicity in the death of Iphigenia, and then the fact that they suppress their complicity. But we don't even need this. I mean, that would be arguable. I think that's very much there, but it's not something everyone who reads the play would accept, at least at first glance. But we don't even need this. Their standards for judgment are so strict that they can never, in principle, be met. They tell us they only believe what they see, but what they would have to see, not just what happens, but the cause of what happens, is not something that ever becomes visible. The Greek word, interestingly, for cause is, here it is, aitia. And aitia means cause, but it also means responsibility. And you can see why. I mean, if you're the cause of something, you're responsible for it. But then it also means guilt. So that's actually what they would have to see in order to be able to see what they claim to see. When they maintain this strict standard, what's interesting in the Agamemnon is that they get totally paralyzed. There's that wonderful scene where, in something unprecedented in all of Greek tragedy, other than this tragedy, of the ones we have, that is, of the 32 that we have, they can't decide what to do when Agamemnon cries out, and they split up into 12 individual voices, which of course means that they can't act as one, which means they can't act, since the chorus is /are a single character in Greek tragedy. This isn't like the jury of the Eumenides. Yeah, the jury in the Eumenides will turn out to split pretty much in half, but so they're evenly divided, but that doesn't mean that each side hasn't made up its mind. The curious thing about the Agamemnon is that nobody seems to be able to decide on anything. The demand really to know, to see, means that it's never possible to come to a judgment. That, of course, has something to do with why they can't understand Cassandra. It's an interesting fact about Greek that the word that really means to know, that there are, you could imagine in a culture where knowledge was so important, there are multiple words for verbs for to know. But the one that, in a way, that Plato uses most powerfully is eidenai, which actually is the perfect sense, the perfect tense of the verb to see. So to know is to have seen. There are other beautiful things like that in Greek. The verb, we have one verb, to stand, which actually means getting up and standing, and it implies an action. And it also involves, you can also use it to mean he stands there. He doesn't move at all. So in Greek, in ancient Greek, the first digression is that the verb in Greek, to stand, means the action of standing up, say from a seated position. The perfect tense of that verb, which would be to have stood, means to be standing, because you have stood, then you're standing. Whereas in English, the distinction is much harder to make. That was an absolutely authentic digression, has nothing to do with anything that we're talking about. Now, this problem of knowledge in the libation bearers becomes thematic. What you learn by inference, you don't really know fully. That's I talked about it in terms of another of Aeschylus's tragedies, the Prometheus Bound, where it turns out that Prometheus, whose name means forethought, knows everything that's going to happen to him, but doesn't actually know it because he hasn't experienced it. So what you see is by itself, in a way, insignificant. The hair, the web or net or robe, whatever it is that Agamemnon was trapped in, these things without inference don't give you anything. So the problem of justice really turns out to be how it's possible to come to knowledge of cause, and so of responsibility, and so of potential guilt, a knowledge that's sufficient to justify punishment. And that's, of course, the problem of the jury trial, which is where the whole thing is headed. So it looks as though Aeschylus has reached back into the mythic past to try to show the Athenians, and incidentally us as well, how strange something is that is a part of their everyday world and seems to them perfectly ordinary. That's what tragedy does. It's a sort of restoration of the original meanings of words to shed light on their later meanings. So the two words in Greek, theogein and diogein, and they're both verbs. Theogein means to run away, to flee. Diogein means to pursue. So in the 22nd, is it 23rd, whatever, Achilles is chasing Hector around the walls of Troy, the verb is used to mean that Achilles is pursuing him and Hector is fleeing. By the time you get to 5th century Athens, the meaning of theogein has turned into, not completely, it can still, of course, mean to flee, but a very powerful meaning, and maybe the first to come to the mind of an Athenian, is if you're theogein, you're defending yourself against someone who is diogein, who is prosecuting you. So they take on a legal meaning that they didn't have in Homer at all. Language is very much like that. If you take one of the words for good, or good, better in Greek is kratos. Kration would be the comparative, better. Maybe it's because the Greeks are so good, and maybe because they're not so good that they have so many words that can mean good. Hard to know which it is, but the word literally comes from a verb which means to be strong or to exercise your dominion over. So it means strong, and then it becomes one of the many words that they use for good, agathos and others. That seems crazy until you think of the following. Somebody asks, how's your class going? And I say, oh, there seem to be an awful lot of very strong students. Well, I don't mean that you lift weights. I mean that you're really good students. So the slide from, it's not just in Greek that a slide from strong to good is easy. It's in English, and I presume in many other languages as well. Probably the single most powerful example for tragedy of this sort of transformation is that when Sophocles writes the play Oedipus Tyrannos, the second word, tyrannos, means in the time of the mythic plot, it just means king. By the time you're in 5th century Athens, it means tyrant. So he's done this very, very beautiful thing. He's given you the title of a play, which you think, oh, well, just Oedipus the king because we're talking about the good old times. But the echo of tyranny is in your mind all the time because in 5th century Athens, it means tyrant. Okay, so now I'm really lost about where we are. It's a good thing I have notes because otherwise I would have no knowledge. Because if I can see it, it must be worth saying, right? Okay, so all of this has something to do with why Aeschylus might do this strange thing and link up the founding of the Athenian legal system, which is what he's really talking about, with the approval of matricide. That's what's really so strange about. I mean, so that why should the first jury trial be a trial about matricide? It seems like a very, if you look at it from our point of view, legally, matricide is not a crime. Murder is a crime. So matricide couldn't be the paradigmatic crime because in a way, the whole point is that once you go to trial, it doesn't matter who you killed. If you killed somebody, you could say if it's matricide, you're actually even less likely to repeat the crime. So maybe the punishment shouldn't be as bad, right? Because you can't do it twice. So there's something very strange that just slides right past us. We're not talking about a repeatable offense, about a crime in the way we tend to think of crimes. We're sort of talking about something else, and for some reason, Aeschylus has decided he wants to make this the paradigm for trial. So the first trial is admittedly very peculiar on these grounds, but also on other more sort of obvious grounds. Look at your page 250. I think it's 250. Is it 250 or 260? Yeah, it's line 667 following. This looks wrong. Have I got it wrong? Okay, yeah. So this is Apollo. And for my part, Pallas, that's another name for Athena. In other things, I will do all I can to make your city and your people great, just as I sent this man to the hearth of your house, that he might be true or trustworthy for all time, and that you might gain him as an ally goddess, him and those after him, and that this covenant might abide forever for these men's progeny to revere. Okay? And then look a couple of pages later, 254, and you get the Furies saying this at line 711. But mark well, our company might prove grievous for your land. I advise you in no way to dishonor me. So Apollo bribes permanent alliance with Argos, and the Furies threaten. Look out if you cross us. Now, that's the first thing. Second thing, Orestes is from Argos. He's an Argive. He's not an Athenian. They really don't have any jurisdiction. Why are they trying him in Athens? It's a very peculiar thing. Third thing, the jury are never given crucial information that would be absolutely necessary for them if they were to decide fairly. Information that we know, and so we sort of tend to supply without realizing it, but they don't know. They don't know about Iphigenia, so they haven't any idea why Clytemnestra killed Agamemnon. They don't know that the oracle was hypothetical. that Apollo persuaded Orestes. We're told that in this play, line 84, on your page 217. He didn't make him do it, he persuaded him. So they're being asked to decide not whether there were extenuating circumstances for this matricide, but it's as though Aeschylus has made them rather forced to decide whether mother killing is okay, in principle. Now, since the jury isn't the chorus here, it might have been, it's perfectly, you could rewrite the play and it'd be very easy to make the jury the chorus rather than the Furies. But because they're not, we never see why exactly they vote as they do. But for whatever reason, this first trial ends up in a tie vote. Now, we'll see, when we look at that passage, we'll see that that's not quite right. A lot of people read it that way, but I think it's pretty clear if you look at the way it's put that in fact there are 12 people on the jury and there are 11 people on the jury and it's split 6-5 in favor of condemnation. So when Athena intervenes, it's not for the sort of reason, oh, well, I have to break a tie. No, it's to force it to be a tie and to establish hereafter that the tie goes to the defendant. So she's supposed to be using this as a way, her rationale for even assembling this jury is that she wants to get the gods out of the business of intervening directly in human affairs. But in fact, the whole thing ends up with her having to make the decision anyway. So let's recap. What does the first jury trial look like? The jury trial that's supposed to be the paradigm for all jury trials. A jury that has no jurisdiction hears insufficient information. They're threatened and bribed directly in public by the prosecution and the defense attorneys, who just happen to be gods, so you have to take them sort of seriously, and they're unable to reach a decision. So, simple question which should come to you is, why does Athena arrange this mockery of a trial to be the paradigm for all trials? Now, my hypothesis, Athena brings it about that all future juries will be able to convict the innocent and let the guilty go without fear of being pursued by the Furies themselves, without fear of feeling guilty. And that's an absolutely necessary condition for the functioning of any jury system. Otherwise, all juries would behave like the chorus of old men in the Agamemnon and be unable to come to a decision. So the anonymity their motives for the jury's motives, in other words, which is still true, that their deliberations are in private, their motives are left unclear because they're mute here. They never say anything. The anonymity of the jury is not an accident. It's absolutely essential for the thing to work. And it's also essential, when you think about it for a minute, that the paradigm, the first jury trial, has to be a bad one. If it were good, if it were perfectly acceptable, then it wouldn't need any defense. So the problem is you got 12 human beings, or 11 in this case, human beings deciding the fate of a person. Well, if that worked all the time, everybody would nod knowingly and say, yes, that's fine. See, we have jury trials. But in fact, that doesn't need any defense. That just seems perfectly clear that you would opt for that. So You need a much more complicated defense, which in some way says, look, all of these things go wrong. They have these private motives. They can be terrified. They can be bribed. They may not hear all the relevant information. All of these things that I ticked off as I went, and then the conclusion is it's still better than what came before. That's somehow the claim. So this is a very sophisticated defense of the Athenian legal system. One little final point in the introduction. Not little, but we've done it sort of. If you go back to the end of the Libation Bearers on 193, you get this description of the Furies. Top of the page. Here are ghastly women like decaying gorgons with dark raiment and thick clustered snakes for braids. I cannot stay. What are these seemings, O dearest of all men, to your father that vex you? Stay, do not be afraid, your victory is great. Seemings have no part in these troubles for me, for I know that these are my mother's wrathful hounds. Yes, for the blood is still fresh upon your hands. It is that makes turmoil come upon your mind. O Lord Apollo, see they multiply, and they drip from their eyes a hateful stream. There is but one way of cleansing. Loxias by his touch, Loxias is Apollo, will free you from these troubles. You do not see these, but I see them. They hound me on. I cannot stay. So we know about that. Now look at the description that we get in the Eumenides. This is on 213 at line 48 through 59. We get this. Not women, but gorgons, I call them. This is the prophetess speaking. No, not even to the shape of gorgons can I compare them. I've seen before now paintings of those that carried off the feast of Phineas, but these appear wingless, black, altogether nauseating, not hateful, in their ways. And they snore with a blast unapproachable, and from their eyes they drip a loathsome liquid, and their attire or their adornment, their cosmos, literally, is such as one could not bring near to the statues of the gods, nor into the houses of men. I have not seen the tribe of this company, nor the land. It's a word that is a poetic synonym, really, of Gaia, so earth, that can boast to breed this race, unscathed and not repent of its labor. So somewhere between the Libation Bearers and the Eumenides, Orestes has become sane and the Furies have been externalized. They're not the same Furies in the Libation as in the Libation Bearers. For example, there are no snakes in the hair. Surely the prophetess would have mentioned that. So we need to see we need to sort of hold on to this and see what it might mean. And the easiest way to do that is to start the play actually and look at the prologue. He calls her the Pythia. Most texts that we rely on call her a prophetess. I suppose prophetess would be, it's literally prophetess in the Greek, and we would say something like prophetess. So she has a prologue, 63 lines, line 1 through 63. First half is a prayer. If we read it, we get this. Start with the first 8 lines. First among the gods in this prayer, I honor, give precedence to, and it's a presbeo, and it has a connection to the word for old person or elder in Greek. So it's really I honor or give precedence to, but it has a sense in it of precedence in time. I honor the first prophet, Earth, Gaia, and after her Themis, means right, but not really connected to cities. It has a kind of divine, a sense of divine right. She who was second to take her seat in this place of prophecy as a logos, as a word or a speech tells. And in the third allotment, in succession, with the consent of Themis, literally Themis, the willing one, and with no violence done to any, another Titaness, a child of Earth, but here Earth is called Thonos, took her seat here, Phoebe. And she gives it as a birthday gift to Phoebus, Apollo, and he bears a name taken from Phoebe. So Phoebus Apollo is what we call him. Now, you start with presbyteo, which means to give precedence and precedence in time. So the first in importance, the first in time here is who? It's Earth, Gaia. Now, there's a famous epic poem, Hesiod's Theogony, which tells about the origin of the gods, the birth of the gods. The genesis of the gods is literally what the title means. So according to Hesiod, first comes chaos, and then after chaos comes Earth. His genealogy looks something like this, that Earth comes to be after chaos. And then as soon as Earth comes to be, Ornos comes to be. And that we've talked about before, because as soon as you have Earth, you've got something surrounding Earth. So they're in a way simultaneous, but she has priority. And then Earth and Uranos together generate the Titans. And the three and the four maybe who are named here, Themis, Phoebe, Kronos, and Rhea. Now, Kronos and Rhea, Phoebe, we're told, is the mother of Leto. Kronos and Rhea give birth to Zeus. Zeus and Leto give birth to Apollo and Artemis. So that's all implied by what he does. I mentioned this before, but when we talked about it, what's curious about, what's really important about so this is the first generation of gods. This is the rule of Uranos. Second generation, the rule of Kronos. Third generation, the rule of Zeus. And to understand Hesiod's Theogony, the way he presents it, you have to understand what happens. I mean, gods for us seem like they ought to be forever, but apparently they're not. There is a genesis, a coming to be of the gods, and also a passing away, at least of their influence. The difference between the first two generations of gods and the third is that the first two generations much more clearly stand for natural phenomena. Here especially, you don't know whether you're talking about earth, the stuff, heaven, air, what's up there, or whether you're talking about persons. It becomes slightly more personalized here, but still Kronos is a sound-alike for time. And then by the time you get to the third generation, the Olympian gods, they still stand for things, but their personhood is much more highlighted. So in this prologue, in the first 8 lines, the prophetess goes out of her way to make the transfer of the oracle seem perfectly peaceful. So if you look at line 5, the consent of Themis is literally in Greek, Themis, the willing one. A participle is used to describe her. And then a couple of lines after that, I can't find, oh no, it's the same line, with no violence. So she goes out of her way to make the movement from it within the who's in charge of this oracle at Delphi look as though it is perfectly peaceful. But when she says this is on the previous page, I'm sorry. Bottom of page 207, in this place of prophecy, as a logos tells it, as an account or a speech tells it, she goes out of her way to hint that there might be alternative logoi, alternative accounts. So what's crucial when we think about it as in as broad a context as we can is that what she has suppressed initially is the castration of Ouranos by Kronos. That's how Kronos takes over and becomes the top god. He attacks his father and castrates him. And according to Hesiod, line 183 of his poem, the Furies are born from the blood of that castration, which falls to the earth, to Gaia, and inseminates the earth. And the prophetess has also suppressed the war between Zeus and the Titans, the overthrow of Kronos by Zeus. It's very interesting, and also the reason why Lloyd-Jones shouldn't call her the Pythia. It's very interesting that Pythian, which is a common epithet of Apollo, occurs nowhere in the Eumenides. So this points to the suppression of the stories according to which Apollo founds the oracle. There are 2 versions of that, by the way. The oldest source we have for it, I think Lloyd-Jones even points to it, is a Homeric hymn, but it occurs elsewhere. The 2 versions are these. Hera, Zeus's wife, is jealous of Leto, with whom Zeus has had relations, and she pursues Leto, who is now pregnant with Apollo, all over the earth, such that Leto is not allowed to give birth. Poseidon, Zeus's brother, has pity on her, and he raises up Delos from underwater. Once Apollo is born, he kills Pytho, the snake that inhabits the area around Delphi, and therefore he becomes Pythian Apollo. The place where he killed the snake is Pytho, is essentially Delphi. Or, second alternative, Apollo searches for a place to found his oracle, asks a nymph who suggests Pytho, but doesn't tell him of the snake there, which Hera had used to suckle the monster Typhon. Typhon was created in order to overthrow Zeus in one of Hera's moments of marital pique. Apollo kills the snake and founds his oracle at Delphi. Now this is hinted at, that Aeschylus knows this story, because at line 22 he talks about the nymphs who live in the Corycian cave. That cave is the name of the cave where Typhon lived. So you could say Aeschylus goes out of his way to remind us that he's revising the story, or that he's having the prophetess revise the story. This comes out much more clearly in the sequel. So Every pre-Olympian god actually named in lines 1 through 8 is female. Gaia, Themis, Phoebe. In the next 24 lines, up through line 33, all the gods are Olympian gods, and with the exception of Athena, who is very interesting, given what she says about always siding with the male later on, and with the exception of Athena and the unnamed nymphs, they're all male. Apollo in line 8, Athena in line 9, Hephaestus in line 12, Zeus in line 16, Apollo again, line 19, Zeus line 19, Athena line 21, Bromius, who is Dionysus, in line 28, and Zeus again in line 28. Also interesting, if you go back to the beginning, first among the gods in this prayer, I honor the first prophet, Earth, Gaia. What's interesting is that if you jump down to line 11, you get the same word. He came to this, yours translation is land, it's Earth, Gaia, and to his seat upon Parnassus. But in the first instance, it's got to be a reference to a goddess, and in the second instance, it can't be a reference to a goddess. So they didn't have any distinction between capital and small letters yet. Everything was written in caps, so it's the same word, but it can't mean the same thing. And he does, just so that you'll know it's not an accident, he does exactly the same thing with the other word he uses for earth, chthonios, in line 6. It has to be a god. Another Titaness, a child of earth, chthonios, took her seat here. And then 7 lines later in line 13, he says, Hephaestus, the road makers who made tame the chthonios before untamed, the chthona. So what's he done? Despite the prophetess who begins with Earth and takes her really seriously as a goddess, as the goddess, even so, she gradually gets de-deified in the speech. Now, there's also a reference later on, line 26, to Pentheus. Pentheus was attacked by the followers of Bacchus, the Bacchantes. That's the title of Euripides' tragedy that we'll read later in the year that ordinarily goes in our language by the name the Bacchae. Pentheus was attacked for not believing in the newest of the Olympian gods, Dionysus. So what's going on? She suppresses the hostility of Olympian to pre-Olympian gods. Everything looks so smooth and nice and peaceful. And yet she can't help but reveal the tension. At line 7, Phoebe gives Apollo the oracle as a birthday gift. But at line 16, Zeus is said to be the one to give Apollo prophetic power. So what we've got is a tension, you could say, between old gods and new gods. And that tension is presented as a tension between female and male. What she presents as a continuity is really a replacement of the mother, the Ur-mother, Gaia, by the father, Zeus. So you could say, you have to allow a little poetic license, but what the heck? Zeus's Olympian rule is in some way based on matricide. So that makes what's going on in this play interesting. Now, let's look at her report of what she saw inside. So you look, starting at line 34, in the second part of her speech, after she comes out from the temple. By the way, I think I've mentioned this before. As helpful as these stage directions are, if you find them helpful, of course, you use them. They make you notice things you might not otherwise notice, but none of them there. That's just not there in Greek tragedy. So and sometimes even Lloyd-Jones is usually pretty good, overdoes it and gives you more than he really has any right to give you. So be very careful of anything except the lines that are said. If we start on 34, dread to tell of and dread for the eyes to see is the thing that has sent me back from the house of Loxias, so that I have no strength left and cannot hold myself upright. I run with my hands, not with the swiftness of foot, of legs. For an old woman is afraid of nothing, no better than a child. For an old woman afraid is nothing, no better than a child. I was on my way to the inner chamber with its many chaplets or wreaths, and I saw upon the navel stone, this Delphi is supposed to be the navel of the earth, the center of the earth. I saw upon the navel stone a man polluted in the sight of the gods, seated there as a suppliant. His hands and newly drawn sword were dripping with blood, and he held a branch of olive grown on high, a branch wreathed moderately with a great tuft of wool, a silvery fleece, for so I shall describe it clearly. And in front of this man slept a wondrous troop of women seated upon chairs. And then you get the description I read earlier, after which, line 59, you get, the outcome now must be the care of the master of this house, the mighty Loxias himself. He is both healer, prophet, and observer of, I can't read my language, so I'll just let you read what's there. Okay, so we naturally assume that she goes into the temple, sees the 12 Furies, and she's terrified. But look, they're asleep. And we don't get the description of them first, we get the description of Orestes first. They're described as loathsome, but they're not described as dangerous. The only hint of that is the overtranslation that Lloyd-Jones gives you of hateful. She never calls them gods, and she doesn't seem to recognize them. The only clear threat in the image is Orestes. He has a bloody sword in his hand, a sword that's wet with blood. Now, we're a little startled here. I mean, up until now, it's not at all clear why she, the priestess, has to be in the story at all. I mean, you could just begin with Apollo and Orestes. Or you could even begin with Orestes at Athens and let the jury be the chorus. Since it's particularly unusual in a Greek tragedy to change the scene quite so much, the move from Delphi to Athens is there's something jarring about it. But when we think about it for a minute, we recognize that she has to recognize Orestes. She was the one who told this man, because you don't go to Apollo, go to the oracle and talk directly to Apollo. You always talk to his priestess. I mean, the story was that she sat upon, a little hole in the ground, and and hot air came up of some sort that intoxicated her and made her speak in riddle-like fashion. There's just been so much written about that. But in any case, she's what you hear. You never hear Apollo directly. So he had to go to the oracle, the temple, go in, ask some sort of a question, and be told, as he understood it, to kill his mother or suffer the Furies. So her prayer, in which she tries to trace it all back to the Ur-mother, to Earth, is in its way an attempt to propitiate the mother, the one she got killed. So no wonder she's afraid when she sees Orestes. she's terrified because she's aware of what she's done. Now, what about her description of the Furies? Not women, not gorgons, not harpies, never seen or painted. According to the 2nd century AD historian Pausanias, Aeschylus was the first one to put snakes in the Furies' hair. But not here, only in the libation bearers. In the libation bearers, they're relentless. They drive Orestes mad. Here, they fall asleep. These women who are called daughters of the night, at line 322, who therefore, if you go back to, we didn't get that part of the theogony, if you go back to the theogony, they're among the oldest of the gods, descended from chaos. But they're totally unknown, even to the prophetess who is guilty. This is the surprise, huge surprise, at the beginning of the play. Prior to Aeschylus, Erinus, the singular, and Erinnes, the plural, you could use either because it doesn't really imply a number. It's certainly, before Aeschylus, you're not talking about 12 black-clad old hags. You're talking about inner turmoil. But Aeschylus externalizes them for the first time. The play about the rule of law begins with the externalizing of guilt. But it's not so clear that guilt, once externalized, is recognizable as guilt. And so they're not the same Furies. One detail sticks out. We don't know whether what its importance is more than this, but they've changed. They no longer have snakes in their hair. The rule of law, decay, becomes, in the rule of law, decay comes to mean not right, but punishment. And this, in turn, means that lawbreakers are afraid of punishment, but they're not necessarily subject to feelings of guilt. Guilt is something like punishing yourself. When somebody takes over the responsibility for punishing you, it's not so clear that you feel guilty. So Orestes is not any longer mad. Now, while the Furies present themselves as among the oldest of gods, the prophetess, the Athenians, they aren't recognizable. So they're new. Aeschylus has done this very curious thing. He begins this play with an ambiguity. The oldest gods are the newest gods. And we don't understand what that means. That's one of the things we have to figure out. Why are these gods who are in a way older than any of the other gods that are presented in the play somehow not recognizable to anyone as gods? There are certainly, people are aware that there are Furies and they're afraid of the Furies, but they don't understand these gods, these beings to be the Furies. No, I think it implies that she's terrified that she may have made a very bad misjudgment. I mean, you could say what this is an expression of is the ordinary person's sense that mother killing is somehow horrible, and that she, instructed by Apollo, told him to do it. Hence, we get what we otherwise, I mean, what looks like a very, informative beginning. We have to know where we are. We got to know what an oracle is. We got to know why Apollo is, so she gives a kind of short history. It's a Wikipedia version of how Apollo got to be top god at Delphi. And in the course of doing that, she goes out of her way to do two things: to really emphasize the prominence of Earth and all these female gods, and to make it look as though it's utterly unproblematic, the transfer to Apollo. So there's no tension whatsoever. But we're struck by the fact that on this side of the account, they're all women, And on this side of the account, they're all men except Athena. And that there's a long tradition of a historical, sort of mythic tradition of these fundamental battles among the gods that gets totally wiped out in her account. So she's trying to placate her own fear. She's trying to overcome her own fear of this tension. She is a woman working for Apollo who did what Apollo told her to do, and the result was that a mother was killed by a son, and he's now sitting in her temple. So it's not so much, what it is, I think, is a powerful expression, or an expression of just how powerful this sense of the holiness, in a way, of this bond between mother and child is, that she has, in some sense, been responsible for violating. You could say she's trying to reconcile her nature. She's trying to reconcile who she is with what she does. She is a prophetess, and she is female. And it looks as though there's a tension between her job description and something that cuts deeper. And she can't utter, and this is literally an attempt to reconcile that by saying, look, yeah, maybe I work for Apollo, but Phoebe gave it to him as a birthday present. So there's no problem here. She just had this little, all these elder women got together and had a birthday party for Apollo. They probably had clowns and a cake and said, here, Apollo, have the or. I mean, it's all prettied up and made to look ever so easy. And anybody seeing this would know, wait a minute, you left out the castration, you left out all, they had a very troubled relationship, these old gods and these new gods. Now, it ought to be possible to think that together with this other issue, which is really interesting, that if we take the Furies at their words, there are really senior gods, but they're utterly unknown. They're just, that's just so startling that what are these creatures? Who are these beings? There's no previous description of them. The word is present in Homer, so it's been there forever, but it means something like being tormented from within. And that gets articulated in a much, much different way here. Okay? Then we get the conversation between Apollo and Orestes. Runs from line 64 to line 93. Apollo's first speech, 64 to 84. 64 to 68, he says, I'll protect you, Orestes. 69 to 73, we get a description of the Furies. 74 to 79, an account of the journey that Orestes has to make. And 79 to 84, what's it all for? Athens, going to Athens. So why does he describe them? He calls them beings with whom no god, man, or beast will mix. He tells us that Orestes has to remember, this is on line 88, remember this, remember, let not fear overcome your mind, and you, my brother, the son of the same father, Hermes, guard him, and so on. But the crucial thing is, remember not to let fear overcome your mind. So Apollo's guarantee is supposed to keep fear from overcoming Orestes' mind. So Orestes, all of this is sure to be very unpleasant, but listen, if they can't get inside you, they're really powerless over you. So you need to ask this question. We need to ask this question too. Even in their dream, when Clytemnestra comes to torment them, they're being chased. So Orestes is afraid. He's being chased by these hound-like creatures. So ask the question, Orestes, what are they going to do if they catch you? What actually happens to you if they catch you? Isn't it the being chased that you're terrified of? But if you actually put it to yourself and say, okay, I'm going to stop, let them do what they will, somehow it's the fear that's the punishment. So Apollo says, oh no, don't let fear get into your mind. And in fact, if you don't let fear get into your mind, they don't have anything on you. They can't do anything. That's what they are. They're beings who make you terrified and so very miserable. But if you say to yourself, so what are they going to do? They're not, I mean, all the images I use make it sound as though they're like dogs and they're going to rip at my legs and my innards and stuff, but they're not. They're 12 old women. So what are they actually going to do? They're repulsive and they're nasty, but if they're standing there saying these terrible things about you and you don't let it get to you, you're free in a way. Very unpleasant in its way, but nothing to terrify you in the way that you're terrified. So this is borne out in the sequel, in Clytemnestra's speech, her really soliloquy, while the Furies are asleep, from line 94 to 139. I don't sleep, she says, why do you? She tells us, this is one of the curious things that Aeschylus does. I don't really understand it. I'm sure it's necessary to understand it. At a certain point, she says, after all the sacrifice, I think he has offerings. Full many an offering of mine have you lapped up, but offering is really a sacrifice that she makes. When exactly did she do that? She made sacrifices before she died? So she knew she was going to be killed by Orestes? Or what would it mean for someone who's already dead to make sacrifice? So there's something very peculiar about this claim. But let's pass that by. Look on 217. This is somehow the crucial thing. In a dream you pursue your beast, and you bay like a hound that never ceases to think of the slaughter. What are you at? Up, do not be overcome by toil. Do not be ignorant of my misery, made soft by sleep. Let my just reproaches sting your heart. For to the moderate, to the temperate, these are goads. Waft your bloody breath upon him. Dry him up with its vapor, your belly's fire. After him, shrivel him up in a second pursuit. So, she's the real fury here. These furies are not furies. They're asleep. Presumably, real furies never sleep. And yet, what's interesting is the chorus don't experience her as a fury. We see, because we're watching Clytemnestra, we see the cause of their dreams. But what do they experience? Look on 218, tail end of the first strophe, 146. Slipped from the net and vanished as the beast, vanquished by sleep, I've lost my prey. Ah, son of Zeus, you are a thief. Young as you are, you have ridden us down, aged divinities, respecting the suppliant, a godless man, bitter to parents. You have stolen away the matricide, God that you are. What is there in this that any shall say is just? To me in my dreams there came reproach, and smote me like Decaen, a charioteer, with goad grasped in the middle, under my heart, under my vitals. It is mine to feel heavy, most heavy, the sting of the public scourger's cruel lash. Now, so we get Clytemnestra is inside the Furies, who are supposed to be inside Orestes. That would be the old way. But in fact, we get Clytemnestra outside of the Furies. They don't see her. She's the sort of objective character that we see. And then the Furies who are asleep get within them what? Looks like something like dogs. And that is to lead them to pursue Orestes. So we see the discrepancy between the cause of their guilt and their guilt. They feel guilty, but they have imagined something like what they're doing to Orestes. But since Orestes doesn't imagine it, he just feels scared. That's why Apollo told him to remember his innocence. Now, this whole issue gets revealed again by the structure of the parados. Divides into three. You get, into three strophic pairs. Strophe A, 143 to 48, Antistrophe A, 149 to 54, Strophe B, 155 to 161, Antistrophe B, 162 to 67. They're short. Strophe C, 169, 72, Antistrophe C, 174 to 77. The first pair, Strophe A and Antistrophe A, it's an attack on themselves by themselves when they say, "We have suffered, dear ones, much have I suffered, and all in vain. How we suffered a grievous blow, alas, unbearable. Slipped from the net and vanquished is the beast. Vanquished by sleep, I have lost my prey." So they feel guilty. Strophe A gets transformed, though, very quickly in Antistrophe A to an attack on Apollo. "Ah, son of Zeus, you're a thief, young as you are," and the rest of it. So guilt gets externalized as anger against another, and it gets purged in that way. The same pattern is repeated in the second strophic pair, except that the issue gets generalized. The dream is experienced as, not as Clytemnestra, but symbolically. And the issue of Orestes' guilt is explicitly conflated with the guilt of the young gods. So Orestes is guilty, Apollo helped him escape. The young gods always treat us in this way. So the whole understanding of the Eumenides turns on what Aeschylus did. This externalization. There's a beautiful and interesting passage in Virgil's Aeneid. This is in book 4, line 470 or so. He's talking about Dido after Aeneas has jilted her. He says this. See if I can find a good place to begin. Even as raving Pentheus sees the Furies band, a double sun and twofold Thebes rise to view. Or, as when Agamemnon's son Orestes, driven over the stage, flees from his mother, who is armed with brands and black serpents, while at the doorway crouch the avenging Furies. Virgil's seems, this is the time, the inner time of the Aeneid. This is right after the Trojan War, when Aeneas flees Troy and ends up first at Carthage and has an affair with Dido. Long before 5th century Athens, when Aeschylus wrote the play about the Furies. But you see what he says about Orestes? Driven over the stage. He's turned him into a character. He's turned the Furies who were pursuing Orestes into characters on a stage. So they get externalized and get put on stage as real beings, not inner beings. And this fundamentally changes them. Think of it in this way, to sort of get a sense of what's at stake. In our era, probably not so much anymore, but certainly when I was your age, it was probably more popular to understand yourself in terms of Freudian psychology, which really meant sort of pop Freudian psychology. Think what it means that the human psyche is analyzed in terms of the id, the ego, and the superego. That's first meant as an analysis of yourself. This is to explain to you how you work. But very soon it gets popularized and comes to be experienced as what is done to you by one other than yourself. It becomes possible to be victimized by your superego. So an analysis, which was supposed to be an analysis of responsibility, aitia, gets experienced as a release from responsibility, because in understanding what it is, the structure of what it is that accounts for why you're behaving the way you're behaving, turns on identifying something not strictly speaking you, which is working on you to make you what you are. So the very attempt to understand why you're responsible ends up relieving you of responsibility. Aeschylus has foreseen that the way that works, that the articulation of the Furies, the giving them a being independent of this much less articulated version of them that floats around inside you and makes you feel guilty, turns them into beings who have a cause of their own. They are, in a way, your enemies to be overcome. They're not a part of you. So it turns out that, in a way, you could say, Orestes has a conversation with Apollo and it runs like this. Apollo, what am I going to do? These beings are constantly in my head and they're going after me and they're pursuing me and so on and so forth. And Apollo says, just keep them out of your head. Look, they're out there. Right now they're asleep and they will chase you to Athens and you'll have a trial and all of that. But as long as you don't let them into your head, you're fine. What can they do to you? So in order to understand what's in your head, you have to somehow reify it, turn it into a thing. And when you turn it into a thing, it changes fundamentally what it is. So it looks as though Aeschylus is doing a bunch of things. He's trying to understand that, the way that happens. You could say the way guilt gets turned into anger. That's what happens with the Furies. They feel guilty. Next strophe, the antistrophe, antistrophe A, they get angry at Apollo. That releases them from their guilt because it becomes something other. The cause becomes something other than themselves. They're purged of their guilt on the basis of articulating what it is that made them angry. So he's seen that, and the movement from the libation bearers to the Eumenides is reflecting on that. He's thinking about how that works. He's also thinking about how that's connected to the very nature of a legal system and the relation between these two different notions of guilt. And at the same time, he also understands, and this we're not even close to understanding why he's doing this yet. He understands this as a tension between the female and the male, and he has understood that in terms of the oldest of old at odds with the Olympians who understand themselves to be the new gods. All of those things have to be woven together for us to understand what's going on in this play. How are we doing on time? Well, we have 5 minutes. Anybody have anything you want to ask? I think we're at a stage now where, if we're where we ought to be, we're really puzzled, but we have a cluster of puzzles that seem somehow connected, and we don't know how they're connected yet. But our hunch is that they're really connected, and if we can sort it out, we'll be able to understand what he's doing. They certainly understand themselves to be gods. They call themselves the old gods. They're said to be descendant from Night, who is being treated as a descendant of chaos. And it's certainly the case that by the end of the play, Athena understands them to be gods. The very curious thing is that before that moment, the curious thing is the way they go unrecognized as gods by other gods. They don't know who they are at first. It's not that they doubt that the Furies are gods, but they don't know that they don't know that these are Furies. I never saw those before. They liken them to Gorgons, but they're not quite Gorgons, and they're not quite this, and they're not quite that. What are these things? So your puzzle is one of our puzzles, that they are, on the one hand, very unfamiliar to people. They're like the new gods. We acknowledge there's something divine about them, but I've never seen them before, on the one hand, but they have a claim to be among the oldest of gods. And so this tension between old and new is intentionally confused by Aeschylus. We don't quite know where to put them. We know they're gods, we don't know what kind of gods they are. Well, I think that Aeschylus thinks it has to do with the fact that in the process of reproduction, the female has a different kind of relation to the child than the male has. So it has to do with the relation with what's at stake in that phrase pathemathos, that has to do with placing all of your reliance in a kind of universal claim to know versus an acknowledgement that there's something that you can't get at that way. And it looks as though he wants to say the male temptation is always the temptation to move in that direction because it's self-justifying, because it's cut off in that way from the relation to the child. It's always a conceptual relation and always sort of moves through ideas, and there's something lacking in that makes the male perennially, I mean, there's a moment in this play where Apollo quite shockingly says, look at Athena. Zeus did that all by himself. He could annihilate women altogether if he wanted to, do away with them completely. Now, in the context, that means what he says, but on the other hand, it also means it looks as though he thinks a certain way of looking at the world is perfectly it works perfectly. And the fact is that the play is is meant as an elaborate example of why that's not the case. Athena understands this and therefore understands, so Orestes wins, he's led off, Apollo leaves, and Athena begs them to stay in Athens and take up a home there. And they work out the details of what that would mean. It looks like they have to stay constantly in Athens, hidden beneath the earth, given a new name, Eumenides, but she somehow is aware of the fact that without them, life is impossible. And it looks as though she can do that because of her curious makeup. She is this sort of weirdly, perfectly open combination of male and female. Obviously, that's just a kind of template for where where we're headed. But you don't want to make the mistake of thinking that Aeschylus is writing a defense of the Athenian jury system and the Athenian political system, therefore, means to agree. Aristides gets let off, but look at the trial that lets him off. There's no way in which Aeschylus thinks this trial is a perfect justification of matricide. It's just preposterous in a way, but in a way necessary. That's what we have to understand, how he understands that compromise to be made.